Continuing on with the exposition of power. To reiterate the philosopher Michel Foucault, he says, if power were never anything but repressive, if it never did anything but to say no, do you really think one would be brought to obey it? What makes power hold good? What makes it accepted is simply the fact that it doesn't only weigh on us as a force that says no, but that it traverses and produces things. It induces pleasure, forms knowledge, produces discourse. It needs to be considered as a productive network which runs through the whole social body much more than as a negative instance whose function is repression. So to continue on with this idea that it's important for us to penetrate in to the networks of power and to alter those networks. The question is, what is the technology, specifically the psychological technology, specifically the linguistic technology, specifically the rational technology that can enable us to make an alteration, a shift within a network of power? The answer to this is polemics. Polemics essentially press against a narrative structure, a propaganda structure, a power network from the vantage of psychology. But it does it through rational procedures. And this is important because these rational procedures are ultimately what guarantee a level of civility toward the method of this alteration of the power dynamics in the first place. Instead of being a form of primitive or raw violence, polemics work through rational means in order to persuade, in order to refute, in order to alter the dynamic of power networks. There's great hope in knowing that power dynamics and power networks do not have the option to simply function on the basis of raw power, that it is necessary to have a mediation process. Now, most of the time, this mediation process is in the direction of greater control and greater oppression of the species, because the power dynamics, the power axioms, the power players, the power fulcrums are not conscious of what is actually taking place within this network. In other words, they don't understand that this type of a procedure acted out upon the species ultimately sabotages the species. It sabotages it because it limits, restricts the number of creative minds from participating in the process of social, rational, intellectual progress. It restricts the number of people that are engaged in the advancement of socialization. And so the probability outcome of having a breakthrough in technology, of having a greater expansion of knowledge, is restricted through power dynamics that are not conscious that by enslaving a portion of the species in oppression, into servitude, into mindlessness, that it is in effect causing a regression on the species itself. So the crucial question has to do with technologies of emancipation. The crucial question has to do with rational and psychological technologies of emancipation. These are the questions that should occupy us within the domain, our networks of power. How can we alter power structures rationally? This is a sane question. And the answer that I have found to this is through polemical tactics. It's not the only answer to the question. There's also the answer of communication, which is bound up in polemics. Polemics make use of communication. There are other answers that can be given to the question, but specifically for intellectuals to fulfill and meet their vocation, their responsibility of praxis, polemics is a crucial and realistic answer to the question. It solves the problem because polemics are geared toward penetrating into the circle of power networks and altering the power network from within. So whereas if you create a military force, that military force is operating according to an idealistic structure, an ideological structure. This ideological structure is essentially driving the activity of the military force. So if polemics are able to penetrate into the circle of power networks and alter the belief structures and the political commitments of a particular power force, then it can ultimately alter the nature of a military force. It can alter the nature of power dynamics. It can move concrete power in the direction of freedom. That's the crucial project. The project is to move the fulcrum of power in the direction of freedom, toward the emancipation of the species unto the edification of the species. And to do this, we can engage in the act of polemics, which is the act of engaging ideology within the public sphere, which is the act of refuting ideology within the public sphere, which is the act of defending freedom, comprehensive freedom within the domain of the public sphere. Essentially, if we want to be literal, we have to make believers of freedom. We must first philosophize a dynamic freedom. And then once we understand the nature of a dynamic freedom, we must make believers of freedom. Individuals who want to move in the direction of freedom. And when this happens, when the dynamics of a power network alter, the interrelational dynamics of a power network alter, then the very apparatus and the very function and the very identity of power itself is altered. Power shifts in the direction of freedom. I don't think it's a question of whether or not we can escape power. It would seem that power is something that is inevitable and probably something that is necessary. But what we can do is engage in a conscious revolution of power. What we can do is engage in a conscious reformation or rebirth of the dynamics that move concrete power. We're looking at the psychological structures which lie behind the concrete actions of power. We're looking to penetrate and alter those belief structures so that we can essentially transform the emphasis and nature of power.